My dear friends, the four seasons are still in the old calendar, and in some areas of the church are still in a modernized form celebrated. In the Italian Missal, for instance, they were always there in the form of prayers you can say at the four seasons on the weekdays that correspond to them. So here we are in the Quattro Tempora of the autumn season. Ember is a corruption of tempora, times. And over the centuries, there would be days when ordinations would take place, and therefore the clergy were prayed for. Now remember that in days of old, they didn't separate the minor orders from the major orders on the actual moment in which they were given. It went in crescendo, and there were all kinds of prayers and chants in between each one. So down at the bottom, up to the top, they were all ordained in a 3-hour-long ceremony. And this would have happened yesterday, and one can see the traces of it in the fact that yesterday's Stazio would have been in St. Peter's. And the readings that we have are an afterglow of ordination. Specifically, we have here the power of the keys. It's something else. I remember coming back from the cathedral in Siena, and thank God the prior had the intuition to go up to the Archbishop immediately after the ceremony and ask for the faculties. And the Archbishop gave them, because without that you can't confess. And that very evening, my next door neighbour, Frère Dominique, came up to me at the rosary at the end of the day before the Madonna in the Abbey Church and said, "Est-ce que tu peux entendre ma confession?" So we had confession immediately after ordination. He got his own back on me because I'd done the same to him a few months earlier. Confession then is something else. When one uses certain formulae in the priestly life, one is not oneself. The Lord is borrowing our voice box. This is his body. He absolves. He baptizes, and on we go. In persona Christi. And I remember being given the life of Don Gabriel Sorte to read in France. He was a great Abbot General of the Trappist order who died in 1963. And during the war years, he was a hero. But he had one awareness. When he celebrated, people knew that he was intensely bonded with his Saviour. He was out of this world. And he maintained, and he made no exception, for aucune exception, anything that a priest asks for at the moment of consecration is granted. And there are profound reasons for saying that. He had become aware of the intimate union and, as it were, coincidence between his person and that of his king at that moment. And remember, in the old rite, it's very intimate. One is alone. There's no noise, and even the consecration is not heard. As also in solitude, in general, it's very intense if one celebrates on one's own with the angels. One is not alone. One can feel a whole cloud of wings waiting for the moment. But I want to zoom into this other sacrament today, confession, for a moment. It concerns us all. We know that the enemy of the church and of our souls has had a huge victory in the last generation or two on this score. He doesn't want confession. And if he can't stop it altogether, he'll make sure that it's insufficient. And don't let anyone pull the wool over your eyes. These modern forms of celebration, which were introduced in Holland years ago, and have caught on in these parts, in which one says one sin, is an invitation in practice to sacrilege. I remember in Rome, before we were ordained, we had to go to the Vatican for a course on hearing confessions in the Sacred Penitentiary. And they said one or two things which were mind-blowing. But one of the priests who lectured to us and worked there did say this in no uncertain terms. For Catholics, he was quoting the Council of Trent who defined it, there is no other means in the ordinary way of things to receive remission of mortal sin, grave sin, sin which kills the life of God in our soul and brings us into darkness and peril for our soul should we die, unless it be sacramental confession. And also, it had to be specific, number and kind. That, remember, is not just a human whim. The Council of Trent was a dogmatic council, and certain formulae defined with the anathema that followed, if such and such says or denies, blah, 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 anathema sit, let him be anathema. That's powerful words. And anything under those forms are protected by the infallibility of the magisterium, because it's engaging it. Therefore, we can't change dogma according to human opinion or whim. It's not in our power. And by the way, if you read carefully the documents of the Second Vatican Council, go into the apparatus at the bottom of each page, what will you find? Each backup, it's each time referring to an authoritative text, principally the Council of Trent, because the Second Vatican Council, as St. Paul VI insisted at the end, was pastoral in nature, and its intent was not to define dogma. Therefore, it's referring to dogma defined and unchanged. It was applying to modern life what is unchangeable, the modalities of relationship and communication, but the same truth. We don't teach the Holy Spirit. Confession. I was reading something that one of you gave me to read recently about the way in which the faith was there until the Reformation in England. And confession, believe you me, was taken very seriously. There are images of priests with their manual while they confess. What was happening there was that the priests had been so well formed that they knew they had to get out all the big bits. And so they had each time this interrogation, and they needed a manual to do it with. They wanted every single soul in their care, the cura animarum, which are responsible for God, to go away cleansed. And remember, massively, at Easter time, the whole of at least these Catholic lands were cleansed in the blood of Christ. The Easter duties, they were observed. So, confession. One of the things recommended as a rule of thumb in this period was be brutal. That meant explicit, even though it might hurt and make you blush. So, be brutal. Be brief. And that, by the way, needs to be looked at, because one can talk and talk and talk and not yet say a single explicit sin. It happens. And make people irritated while they want to come to a real confession in a queue. So, be brutal, be brief, and be gone. That's the advice given in the Middle Ages in Britain, the 3 B's. Remember that before you talk about other people's sins. That's their problem. But Pope Francis has rightly insisted that the confessional should not be a torture chamber, that we are there to help and not drive away, and that could have happened way back. People who didn't know how to handle souls and could actually really upset them and push them away, leave them in desperation. There's a true story, and the proof is that the image can still be seen. It's in Spain, I believe. A way back, this is going back centuries, there was this priest, who was a good priest certainly, but he was fairly keen on getting things right under his terms. And so there was this poor man who was an ordinary practicing Christian who had a sin that he would fall into. He would come and ask for pardon. The priest would warn him, this is a big one, don't go there. He'd come back eventually, having fallen again. The priest would become stronger. He'd come back later in time, and the priest would start to raise his voice and lose patience. Eventually, having made all the effort he could, he fell again and came back in tears and said he'd fallen again. The priest said, "One more chance, but you mustn't fall again." He went away and made really his best possible effort, his blue best to get out of the sin. But after a while he fell again and came back broken and fallen again, Father. That's it. You've abused grace. Come back when you know how to handle things better. And he had to leave the confession. He went to the crucifix and wept and looked up into the eyes of the crucifix. And, this is true, the hand of the crucifix came down, loosened itself from the nail, and leant towards him and held him close to his breast and whispered, "I died for you." And he was to communicate back to the priest. Jesus was the one who actually offered mercy on the cross, and we had to do the same. So no person should go away pushed down. However, and I was told this immediately after ordination, when I started confessing in Rome, the priest said to me, "If you absolve a sin which is ongoing, fai peccato tu, you're committing a sin." We can't do that. We have to distinguish between the past tense and the present tense. If the person is saying, I am, you can't absolve because it's ongoing. I have, but I will not do it again if I possibly can. That's when you can absolve, and only then. That's why it's a pain for a priest when you have a good confession and at the last moment this bit comes up. I'm in a second union. Or the confession falls down because the irregular situation blocks absolution. Then you have to try and find out where they're at and see if there's any way around it within that situation. Again, not pushing them away, but trying to indicate for their own good that there has to be in charge the will of God and not the abuse of grace or a rubber stamp to carry on sinning. And that happens too. Confession before death. I've told you before, in this very pulpit, how in the 1940s a person was being electrocuted in the States in 1947, Jim Hughes, and he was blaspheming and cursing and spitting, using horrible language, and suddenly he screamed, "Ah! Get me a priest." And he had this vision before he died of his place in hell. So, had he not had that conversion, because the priest did hear his confession in the electric chair, he'd be in hell right now, and forevermore! But that absolution changed all eternity in one moment of time, and only a priest can do it. That's why you must call a priest, always call a priest before and not after the person loses lucidity. I'll tell you a story to comfort you. Remembering on this day of Thérèse of Lisieux how she wouldn't relinquish her soul either. You know the story, don't you? There was this brutal sinner who was about to be guillotined. And guillotining was a whole rite in France. In fact, the Oratorians had a house in Paris which overlooked the place where they took place in the quad of the prison. And the seminarians would look out as they happened before dawn and pray for the victims that they might be saved. They could be seen, and there was always a priest there next to them. Fair play, there was always a priest next to the condemned man. And this, therefore, was happening in the 1800s, when Therese wanted and bargained and insisted for the soul of this man that was about to be guillotined, unrepentant. He wouldn't let her go. And he was completely adamant he would have nothing to do with the church. And then she heard that just as he was about to be guillotined, just before they dropped the blade, he turned to the priest and kissed the crucifix. Listen to this. A journey I know well, from Parma down to Florence, down to Siena, was being done by an early Jesuit, Blessed Peter Lefebvre, in 1540, one of the first companions of St. Ignatius of Loyola. He was on the way back precisely to Rome from Parma. While following the way from Florence to Siena, he was overcome by nightfall in the midst of a country infested by robbers and brigands. He had recourse, as was his wont, to his angel guardian, and perceived pretty soon a house at which he asked hospitality. It was in this very month of October. The weather was cold and rainy. The people who dwelt at the manor, seeing that the traveller was a priest, welcomed him with respect and kindness, offered him refreshments, and invited him to draw near the fire to dry his clothes. While he was seated near the hearth and speaking with his hosts of the things of God, fair play for him, he used the time well, a noise of hurried steps was heard. Then violent rappings at the door, and behold, men armed to the teeth dashed into the house. It was a band of brigands. They were 16 in number, when demanded noisily that all the provisions in store should be given to them. Then, having ranged themselves round a table, they set to drinking and eating amid the rude songs and immodest conversation, almost as bad as what we get for Saturday evening in the average Irish pub. Not the best place for a man to be before he receives the Lord of Glory the following day. Blessed Peter Lefebvre was not taken aback. Remember that next time you're attacked. Remain calm. He remained seated, calm, pensive, his eyes fixed on the fire. Rather like the Lord, isn't it? Writing in the sand. The leader of the bandits asked him what he was doing there. No reply. You do not answer. Are you deaf? Are you dumb? No. But a thought occupies my mind. What is this great thought? Tell us. What are you thinking of? I am thinking that the joy of sinners is very sad. This fire brings to my mind that of hell, which they shall not be able to escape if they do not hasten to return sincerely to God. couldn't answer. The servant of God took advantage of the dead silence to speak of them, of the danger they ran of falling into the hands of human justice, and still more into those of God's justice. Then he touched on the security of a good conscience. Do you think that a robber, even a sophisticated fraudster, has joy at night? Do you think that the conscience is completely giving him joy? Or is there some niggling pain? I hope there's nothing really there after death. I hope. And the mercy of God, of whom he spoke in language so touching that he caused them to melt into tears and demand forgiveness of their sins. He encouraged them and prepared them so well that the whole 16 made their confessions to him that night. And I've read stories about priests in the Paris area who had hardened sinners who came not to go to confession, but have a chat with the priest and even challenge him. One great confessor said, when he came to the guichet of the box, "Agenouillez-vous, kneel. No, I've come to talk, kneel. Confessez-vous." And he started. And once he'd started, somehow grace flowed. How many tears have I seen being absorbed by my stone? All kinds of pains taken by one word. I remember in Medjugorje, the year I was ordained, or the following year, because I went there afterwards, I was confessing for hours, a very great place of confession. And one lady, I think it was an Italian, she came up, she was about 30 years of age, she made a good confession like the others, and then I was giving absolution, and I was saying the sacred formula in Italian, "E io ti assolvo nel nome del Padre." Ah! She fell back, rested in the spirit, and had to be carried out by 4 strong men. That was grace hitting the body. It's the real thing, my friends, and only the Catholic Church has it. And the devil knows it and wants at all costs to get rid of this dangerous, dangerous bomb which wrenches souls from his hands.